Welcome to Beyond the Balance Sheet. This is the podcast where we explore how banking connects to people, businesses, and the communities that we serve. I'm Vince Coglianese.
And I'm Patricia Ferrick. Thank you for joining us.
Today, we are joined by Paul Benda, Executive Vice President for Risk, Fraud, and Cybersecurity at the American Bankers Association. Paul leads the ABA's national efforts to protect consumers and banks from cybercrime. And he oversees the popular Banks Never Ask That campaign, which helps people recognize and avoid scams before it's too late. Paul is also the chair of the International Banking Federation's Fraud and Scams Task Force, helping banks coordinate and fight fraud and scams all around the world, and will be representing banks at the UN Global Fraud Summit in Vienna in March.
Paul, welcome to Beyond the Balance Sheet. It's great to have you here. Before we dig in, can you give us a quick sense of what your role at the ABA involves?
Sure, Trish, and thanks for having me. So at the ABA, my group focuses on risk, fraud, and cybersecurity. So it's kind of all in that title there. And really the two main pillars are fraud and cybersecurity. We know that cyber-enabled fraud is a key piece of how people get lured into these scams. And so we look at how do we protect people's bank accounts? How do we stop criminals from hacking into them? How do we stop people from being defrauded? And so we have education campaigns out there, like our Banks Never Ask That campaign. We build tools to allow our bankers to connect with each other. So if one of their customers experiences a fraudulent event, what banker can they contact on the other line to maybe stop the flow of funds? And then we're building other ways that we can work with the government and the regulators on ways that we can better share information across different sectors, whether it's with the telecoms or whether it's social media companies or whether it's other banks internationally.
My impression is that the fraudsters are very nimble, that they're very sophisticated, and that there's constantly new and emerging trends that you probably have to be up to speed on. What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I think, everyone's heard of AI, right? We've all heard of the deepfakes that are out there. And that's something that we're seeing our customers experience, our bank customers experience. And so we're worried about, the grandmother scam. This is one where a criminal will call up someone and pretend to be a loved one in distress. And now they're even taking it to the next level where they're spoofing their voice. So it sounds like your loved one. We're worried about impersonation texts that are being sent. We know of one small bank where they blanketed the entire market with fake fraud alerts saying, "Did you make this Walmart purchase?" And then all of a sudden, the bank started getting all these calls. This is a 3-branch bank. They got 600 calls in one day. And the challenge that I don't think people understand is these criminals now can buy a lot of your data online. With all the data breaches that have occurred around the world, so they'll call you up and they'll say, "Hey, is this John Doe? Do you live at this address? Is this last for your social? I want to talk to you about this potential purchase." So the people think they're talking to their bank because not only do they have that information, but the caller ID might even say the name of their bank and the number that the bank uses for their outgoing calls. And so it really is hard for consumers.
It absolutely is. We hear about social engineering all the time, where criminals trick people, like you said, into giving up personal information or sending money. But why do you think it's still happening at such a high level with so much information out there about it?
Yeah, so I think it leads with that technical authentication I brought up, that caller ID, the spoofing of the name, that personal information they've got. But remember, you're dealing with a criminal industrial complex. These are not, the Nigerian princes of yesteryear, right, with the bad email and the bad spellings. The State Department estimated that there are 400,000 people in camps across Southeast Asia that are used to contact and basically scam people out of their money around the world. 400,000 people. So you think of the scale that's there, and they do this every day. So they're very good at it. They know the right things to say, and they cause fear and they cause intimidation. And they actually take you out of a rational state of mind and put you in that fight or flight perspective. And so they keep telling you, if you don't pay this fine, you're going to lose your license. You missed your jury duty summons, you're going to get thrown in jail. And so people just like, oh, I need to take care of this. I need to take care of this. And at heart, people want to be friendly. They want to be helpful. They want to do the right thing. And the scammers play on that. And they basically instigate this fear into people, and they make decisions that probably if they were thinking rationally, they probably wouldn't.
So in other words, people should be on guard for anybody who's urging them to do something now. You should instinctively think to yourself, wait a second, pause, take a breath, and let me actually call my bank and talk to them first.
That's exactly right. There's two of the biggest red flags. One is if someone is telling you to act quickly, that's a big red flag. The other one is if it's a secret, it's a scam. If they tell you not to tell anyone, that this is going on, it's a scam. So those are the two things that we talk about But they're hard to take yourself out of that situation because these guys are really convinced.
It's amazing. Okay. So how is artificial intelligence changing all of this? I mean, you mentioned voice cloning, and we've seen things about fake videos being used to try and trick people. Are the scammers really diving into this like in a big way now? Is this kind of the dominant way that people are being scammed?
And it's a leading indicator for us, what I would say. So we know the voice cloning is out there. What we're seeing a lot is a lot of these deepfake videos. Yeah. It's really easy to do a deepfake of President Trump and put on there, hey, to get your stimulus check, they'll put an ad up on Facebook or Meta or other platform. Hey, to get your stimulus check, contact these people, and then they try and get your personal information, your banking account information. So that's where we're seeing it is really, people are pretending to be Brad Pitt, and Brad Pitt's in trouble. He's in the hospital and needs your help. We've heard customers, banking customers have reported that a man sold his house and sold his truck and because he was going to get married to Miranda Lambert. And she needed the money for the wedding. Literally, this is one of the stories that we've heard. And so, people believe these things because, they don't understand what AI can do. And then on the even worse side, you might have heard how AI is being used to help people code faster and build better tools. Well, the scammers are adopting this. And so now you might have gotten all these texts that you say, hey, can we talk? Oh, hey, we had this meeting at 9. They're automating all these now with AI, SMS texts that are going out. And they're doing that initial conversation using AI bots. And so then when they finally get someone who's responding and engaging, that's when the scammer comes on.
If I can, there was a scam of this nature because it happened to somebody in my life. My dad's a Marine, a general, and he's got a long military career. But as he accrued that career, all of his biographical details keep appearing on the internet. Stuff about like family members, ages, where his duty stations. So enough for a scammer to try and compile like, hey, this is a real biographical story. And so a scammer in some faraway country tricks some random woman in the country into thinking that she's got a relationship with my father over the internet and that she needs to send all sorts of money to maintain internet connections and all these things. And then I found out this is a super commonplace scam, and it's happening all the time at scale where just poor women oftentimes are being tricked into believing they have these long-distance relationships with con artists who are just stealing money from them. And it's just so disgusting to see, and you're seeing it all the time.
Yeah, it is disgusting. I mean, these people are just evil, and it goes to that she wanted to be helpful. She thought she was helping, your dad, quote unquote, your dad, maintain his internet, or wanted to help, Brad Pitt, or you wanted to help these other people. And so they really do lure these people into a relationship. They're not thinking rationally about it. And we really want to try and get them, and I guarantee you, he was saying, don't tell anyone about this. That's that secret part. As soon as someone tells you to keep something secret, that's a scam. You got to try and find someone you trust to have a discussion with. And frankly, a lot of times your banker knows a lot about these. So don't be afraid to have a conversation with your banker about these types.
Well, as a bank president, I see firsthand how much happens behind the scenes to try to protect our customers. Constant vigilant monitoring and software tools and customer outreach when we see things that look suspicious. So from your national perspective, what are you seeing banks doing to get ahead of it and to prevent fraud before it even reaches our customers?
Sure. So this is something, I think banks invest billions of dollars to protect consumers from fraud every year. And frankly, I think banks do a better job than any other industry. You think about it, when was the last time Facebook sent you a fraud alert? Banks do this, customers get this every day. Banks are even calling up customers when a high dollar check gets written. We've had a big rise in check fraud, not as sexy as, some of these AI deepfake scams, but it's been a huge issue with checks being stolen out of the mail. And we know banks regularly call customers and saying, hey, this big check came through, did you write it? And so I think banks are being a lot more proactive. We understand these impersonation scams that are out there. We're doing better training for our tellers to try and recognize these. Banks routinely look at accounts for transactions that are, what they would consider out of the norm. They try and put friction into that. What we mean is they try and, question the customer. But in the end, a lot of times it's the customer's money, right? A bank isn't our job to tell you how to spend your money or where you can and can't spend your money. We do our best job to say, is this something you really want to do? Is this, an appropriate transaction for you? And if it's legal and it's appropriate and you're of sound mind and body, we have to let them make that transaction. We do everything we can to try and raise those flags. In the end, it's up to that customer.
So let's shift to Banks Never Ask That. It's such a clever campaign. It's funny, memorable, and effective. So what inspired it, and what did you hope to accomplish?
Well, when you talk about cyber scams and fraud and things like that, sometimes people's eyes glaze over. At least my wife's eyes glaze over when I try and talk about it. So we're trying to figure out a way that we can educate people and have it be memorable. And so we decided to go with something more centered on humor. And so the idea is, would a bank ever ask you, do you wear boxers or briefs? Do you believe in aliens? No. Is a bank going to ask you for that one-time use passcode? No, we're not going to ask you for that kind of thing. So what are the things that banks will and won't ask? We've done it in a funny manner. We tried to make it engaging. We've got banksneveraskthat.com. You can go play a scam quiz and test your knowledge and compare your knowledge with your friends and with your family. We've got some really funny actors that have participated with some skits with us to try and just, get people to pause. It's really, Vince, is exactly what you said. Maybe this would, sink in. Hey, this is something I heard about. This is something I remember hearing that video about, and maybe think about it and maybe pull themselves out of that fight or flight syndrome.
Yes. We all have to be way more cynical, don't you think? Yeah. No, it's like, but you just have to be on guard. It's a great thing to train yourself to do. Now, it is, I would admit, pretty rare for a cybersecurity campaign to go viral. I don't know how you even achieved that. This one did it. Has the public responded? What kind of feedback are you receiving from the banks?
So we're getting really good feedback. We've had well over 2,000 banks that participate in this. We send it across the country. We put in different, whether it's Facebook posts or whether it's Instagram or whether it's posts that are on X. And so we're seeing a lot of engagement. One of the best stories that we've got is, we had one of the banks playing one of these reels in place up on their display. And one of the gentlemen that was in line actually saw that and recognized some of the items that we're bringing up in that. And then actually, when he went up to the teller, he said, I think I might be getting scammed here. And he brought exactly what we talked about. He brought up to his banker. They've seen these types of things before. He's like, telling him the information. And actually, it stopped the man from being scammed. And so that was really exciting for us to see that kind of feedback. We partner with our ABA Foundation that helps with a lot of amplification of these tools. But it's been really successful, at least in getting some knowledge out there. There's still a lot more to do.
Can you give examples of the most common scams you warn about? And what should a customer do or consumer do when they get a suspicious message?
Sure. And the thing is, what we do, so Vince, you're right. We got to all be cynical, frankly. Anyone that reaches out to you, you have no idea who they're calling from or who they are. So a lot of these things we see coming through text messages. They try and start up a conversation with you. We see it come in, still get the phishing emails when it could look exactly like your bank. AI allows them to enable perfect examples of legitimate websites with maybe a slight change that's in the URL. And so they'll direct you to try and fill in your credentials in there. They really do try and impersonate, whether it's a bank or a U.S. government employee, to try and give up information. We see them try and say things like, your bank is being investigated. Can you help us with this investigation? Oh, we need to make sure your money's safe because the bank might try and take your money away. So you need to put it in crypto or you need to buy gold bars. And so they create these elaborate schemes. And again, people are trying to be helpful. They want to be helpful. And unfortunately, the scammers prey on that. And so we always trying to, if it's a secret, it's a scam. Everyone's pressuring you, pause and take a step back. But if for some reason you do make a transaction, the first person you do is call your bank, because they have the best chance of potentially putting a hold on those funds that are out there. Your bank can help you work with the FBI. The FBI is an Internet Crime Complaint Center. It's ic3.gov. You can go and file a complaint there. There's a thing called the Financial Fraud Kill Chain that the banks work with the federal government, with different regulators and different law enforcement, where they can reach out to other banks, even banks overseas, to potentially stop it. But honestly, every hour you wait after that transaction occurred means the odds of you getting that money back go down more and more and more and more.
Yeah. It seems like one of the great technological developments of the last decade or so is two-factor authentication, where you have to go to a separate device or somehow in order to confirm that you are trying to actively engage in this transaction. It does feel like that's a good instinct in real life too. Because I've known scams where people reach out, they'll create a fake email address for your boss, and then they'll email you pretending to be your boss. Well, if you're suspicious at all, if you see this and you're like, let me just call them. That's two-factor authentication. Call your boss separately and verify that this is a real conversation and not a scam.
You're absolutely right. I mean, that's because someone calling you, like you said, you don't know who it is, that people can't trust that caller ID. So you can't trust what's being presented to you. But if you make that call, if you call the number on the back of your card, and honestly, the best way to engage with your bank or with a large technology company like Amazon, use the app. Go directly through the app. You can go, it's a very secure login method. You know exactly the information you're getting is accurate, and you can see, hey, wait, that transaction's not there. I don't have any Amazon, purchase that's on my account. Yeah. And then you know right away that someone's trying to scam you.
It's amazing. So the campaign, banksneveraskthat.com, do you think it's making a measurable difference? You detecting that?
We do. We think so. I mean, we had the example where we're seeing, someone that recognized it. It's such a broad problem that any awareness that we can bring to it, we think is going to move the needle.
Yeah.
We know that the scam rates are going up. If you look at, it's really hard to know the scale of the problem we're dealing with right here. There's no central point in the U.S. government to report it. But both the Federal Trade Commission and the FBI have said scams are going up 25 to 30% a year. FTC estimated losses to scams because of underreporting could be as high as $196 billion. Now, that seems a little high to me, but even let's say it's half that, $95 billion. If it's going up 25% every year, it's going up a lot. So anything that we can do to educate consumers, to make them pause, take a step back, we think is going to be helpful.
For our small business owners listening, what advice would you give them about protecting their companies from fraud?
So I would say one of the biggest losses that we see in small businesses is business email compromise. So what happens is, you've got a vendor that you've been working with. All of a sudden, that vendor will email you, and it might even come from their account that says, "Oh, hey, we've started with a new bank. Can you please change the wiring instructions for your next payment?" Trish, you're shaking your head. You probably have experienced this at your bank with one of your customers. Vince, it's exactly what you talked about. Two-factor authentication. Call up your vendor with the number you've used in the past. Hey, did you guys change your wiring instructions? And it's amazing how many businesses forget to take that step. And then all of a sudden, they'll wire the money out. 30 days later, their vendor will come back and say, "Hey, we never got that payment." Well, like we said, hours make a difference in reporting these. 30 days, it's going to be really hard to get that money back. That money is now gone, probably converted to crypto, probably gone overseas somewhere. So that, if I was but that is my number one, there's all the other things you got to be aware of, but that is the number one thing, is making sure that anytime you're working with a vendor, any change to any payment, you verify with the number you've used before and make sure you don't use any of the details in that email. I used to work at a small business. This actually happened at my small business. We actually had a criminal that hacked into our email accounts, was reading the emails as they came in and responding in real time just to those emails that dealt with that payment. It was really creepy when you thought about it. So they're very sophisticated. But the one way you can do it finally ended when our business ops guy walked down the hall to the managing partner and said, "Why do I need to make this payment so fast?" He's like, "What are you talking about?"
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, just imagine, though, you actually get scammed and then money goes out the door, and the sinking feeling when you realize what just happened and your own role in it. So if you get scammed, what's the first step? So now you're going through the panic and you're like, what do I do first? What do you tell people?
So call your bank. So I was sitting at home, 5:30 p.m. on a Friday. I like to have a martini and because it's a long week, right? Got a call through our 1-800-BANKERS. So this is a number we have up for our bankers when they need help for ABA. Came in, I'm like, oh, geez. So I answered the phone. And it's like one of our call center people says, "Hey, there's a bank that want to talk about fraud." I'm like, okay. And so the banker was like, "Oh my gosh, we had one of our people send a $185,000 payment to the wrong address. What do we do?" And so we were talking them through them. Okay, here's the bank. File the complaint with the FBI's IC3. Okay, let's reach out to the receiving bank that got this. Let's send them a hold harmless. Let's make sure we got the affidavits in place that fraud occurred. And I will tell you, it took some time, but 30 days later, they got all that money back. Because they acted with it. It was probably about 24 hours earlier. They realized they'd make that payment. Mm-hmm. So the chances of you getting that money back, if you can do it in that first 24 hours, is really good. But it takes a really quick action. It's a partnership between both the business that executed that, the partnership with the bank and law enforcement and others. And there's a chance you can get that money back, but you got to be quick.
Does happen. We've had some nice wins, so I appreciate that. We've discussed how cybersecurity isn't just a technology issue; it's a people issue. What habits can individuals practice to stay safe every day?
Sure. So I think, Vince, you brought up multi-factor authentication. A lot of people, it's basically de rigueur now on logins for your bank account, for all of, a lot of the big transactions that you have. Make sure it's on all your emails. Think about it. It's pretty much standard now. I think Google and Yahoo have required it, but before they didn't. And we were seeing, once someone hacks into your email, they have access to everything. Your multi-factor authentication sometimes gets sent to email. Don't reuse the passwords. So we see this a lot. A lot of retail sites may not have the same level of security as your bank. We see those get hacked, and then they get your username and password. And then they figure out, oh, this username matches the bank username. And then all of a sudden they know your password. And then they might now send you a fake fraud alert because they've got your phone number from that account. And then all of a sudden they'll say, oh, can you verify your identity with this one-time passcode? Well, what they've done is they've logged in with your username and password that you reused. They use that one-time passcode gets sent to you, and then they type that in and they have access to your account. So making sure that you've got that enabled on all your different accounts that are out there is really important. Make sure you're not reusing those passwords. And that is really, I think the two keys. And frankly, you can't trust anything incoming. I hate to sound cynical, but you can't trust anyone that reaches out to you because the voices can be fake, the numbers on the ID can be fake, they can fake emails that come in. All of those things can be fake. You only know who you're talking to unless you reach out to them.
You're making me paranoid.
Good.
Everyone is out to get me.
They are.
That's what I'm concluding from all
They
of this.
are.
If there's one thing, if you could recommend one thing to everybody who's listening about their behavior that they could change starting today, what would that be?
If you don't have multi-factor authentication on everything, put it in place. I think, one thing would be make your phone the center of your security. Use passkeys where possible, if you've heard of those, where you link it to the biometric on your phone, because honestly, the phone then becomes the whole point. It's a physical token, right? It's really hard to hack that. If they don't have that phone, they can't hack your account. Now, if you lose your phone, you're going to be in trouble, but you can rebuild that. But that's having one central point for your security is really important.
As you look ahead, what do you see as the next frontier of fraud or cybersecurity challenges?
I'm really afraid of what AI is going to do. It just from an automation perspective, we've already seen the deepfakes, we've already seen the voices and the videos and those kinds of things. I'm afraid that we're going to see bots that become very personalized. And so think about this. If I were to, there was a 2.9 billion record public data breach that occurred in 2024, 2.9 billion number, face all that personal information that's out there. I load that all up into a bot, and then I use that bot to then contact whether it's businesses or banks, and they're trying to, reset accounts. And so they're trying to go through knowledge-based authentication to prove who they are. Well, they've got all the access to the information. It happens. Or we start seeing them engage with people at a much more conversational method to make the scammers work easier. The U.S. government, to its credit, has focused on crackdown on overseas scams. They started a task force on it, which we love. The Department of Justice has done that. But we think the criminals are going to realize, hey, I can replace, just like our businesses are replacing people with AI, they're going to replace the scammers with AI, and you're just going to see people get inundated more and more and more. And I'm afraid it's going to create a breakdown in trust. And I'm already recommending don't trust things that are incoming. I think it's going to get worse and worse and worse, and people aren't going to know who to believe. And that's when it's going to be, I think, a really big challenge for us.
Now, on a hopeful note,
yeah, sorry about that.
After all that, what gives you optimism? What makes you think, we can handle this? All these emerging threats, it can be done.
I will say, I've been at ABA 8 years. I've never seen such a focus on fighting scams and fraud worldwide as I've seen lately. We talked about a UN Global Fraud Summit. We talked about the DOJ Task Force, Scam Center Strike Force that's going on. I was on a call with Canadian Bankers Association just this morning talking about how do we share bank contact information in case funds get transferred so that we can reach out to those bankers. We're going to build an international database of bankers so that if your funds go overseas, a U.S. banker can reach out to someone in the UK, Australia, Canada, other places to try and get those money back, and they can reach out to us. The UK government's leading an effort to try and figure out what are the baseline things that we should do to protect all citizens from fraud. And so I'm seeing a really strong effort here in the U.S. that's starting to get underway, seeing a really strong effort internationally to get underway. And AI is a dual-edged sword. We are building those tools into banks. We're recognizing these changes, these anomalous behaviors faster that will hopefully help us stop. The goal here is a shift to prevent that transaction from happening in the first place versus trying to get the money back after it's out the door.
Paul, this has been a very eye-opening conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights and for all the work the ABA is doing to protect customers, consumers, and businesses in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And for all of our listeners, you can explore so much more at banksneveraskthat.com, the super viral campaign. You're going to love it. Banksneveraskthat.com. It's a fun and effective way to learn how to spot scams before they happen. That's way better. Paul, thank you so much for joining us on Beyond the Balance Sheet.
Thanks for having me.